I think I'm supposed to clap or something. So, okay. My name is Herbert. I just completed a King Air 350 type rating, and given my background in primarily citations and single engine pistons, I learned a lot from my new type rating experience, and I wanted to tell you about it. So what is a type rating? Type rating is an authorization to fly a very particular type of aircraft as defined by the FAA. So type ratings can encompass an individual model number, or it can incorporate a whole family of model numbers. An example of this would be both the King Air, which includes the BE 300, the 350, etc. family of aircraft. But another great example would be the Citation series, which I have more experience in, which would be the Citation Latitude Sovereign, have a similar type rating. They also, the classic example would be the Citation CJ family of aircraft. So that bunch of airplanes includes the CJ, the CJ1, the CJ1 Plus, the CJ2, the CJ2 Plus, the 3 Plus, and the 4, as well as the M2, all under the same type rating. Now, for insurance purposes and for just being a safe pilot, obviously you would want training in all those different types if you were going to fly them. But from the FAA's point of view, they are all the same thing. So when is a type rating required? The type rating is required by 6131. It's defined for, quote, large aircraft, turbojet powered aircraft, and other aircraft as determined by the administrator. So basically you're looking at airplanes that weigh more than 12,500 pounds at max gross takeoff weight, and at aircraft that are powered by jet engines, or something sufficiently weird that the FAA thinks that there needs to be specific type training involved. So certain old warbirds, for example, are typically prime candidates for such things. So in the case of the King Air 350, the max gross takeoff weight is 15,000 pounds. Therefore, it's turbine powered over 12,500 pounds and does require a type rating. Now, its similar smaller cousins, the King Air 250, the King Air 90, are less than 12,500 pounds. So even though they are turbojet powered, or turboprop in this case, they don't meet the weight requirement. So you can operate a 250 or 90 without needing a type rating. Where do you get a type rating? Most type ratings are given at Part 142 training facilities, namely flight safety, CAE, and similar facilities. Airlines also can do type training within their own internal systems, which are a different topic. Personally, I did my flight training for the King Air 350 at Flight Safety in Wichita, Kansas. Flight Safety offers type ratings for a wide variety of airplanes at a wide number of facilities. The common thing for all Part 142 operators is they're going to have some kind of full motion-based flight simulator setup. Notably, it's going to be a FAA certified simulator that is capable of sufficiently replicating the operating characteristics and handling characteristics of the aircraft that there's effectively little difference between getting in the airplane and getting in the simulator from a systems operation point of view. You can do type rating in certain circumstances in the real airplane. Doing training for type rating in a, quote, real airplane is a little bit limiting in that you can't do some of the more interesting failure scenarios that you can for a, quote, real simulator or a more typical flight training process for type rating. The hazard of doing some of those maneuvers is sufficient that you don't really want to be doing V1 cuts in a real airplane on a real runway and in real low weather like you get to do in the simulator. So by doing it in the simulator, you have the advantage that you're going to see more extreme scenarios than you would otherwise be able to achieve out there in the real world. So how long did it take to get a type rating? So it varies. Certain aircraft require more training than others. Notably, large turbojets can take 20+ days of training. The good news, the King Air 350 is a relatively simple aircraft. So it took 7 days of ground instruction, studying systems, studying limitations, studying normal procedures and checklists, and then 7 days of simulator training, including the check ride. The big thing with doing a type rating is to plan to spend a significant amount of time studying both before the course and during the course. So even though class is out at 5 o'clock, you still want to go home or go to your hotel that evening and spend a fair bit of time studying the books and getting familiar with the systems that are coming up for the next day's worth of ground or the procedures that you expect to do in the simulator the next day. If you spend time outside of the course doing that extra study, you will see benefits when you get to actually go to class. So what do you do to actually earn the type rating? Like I alluded to, you study and you study and you study some more and you study a lot. The more familiar you are with the aircraft itself and the systems and the limitations, the more successful you're going to be in getting the training. So the type training is split up into two components, like I mentioned. There's the ground portion of the course, and then there is the simulator training portion of the course. So let's talk about ground training. Just like you do when you're studying for your new aircraft checkout in a 172 or a 182 or a Bonanza or a Baron, you're going to spend time in the ground reviewing systems, reviewing limitations, reviewing normal procedures, making sure that you're familiar with how things work in the airplane just mechanically, as well as how to deal with failures and what those indications look like. So a good example in the King Air that we spent a fair bit of time on was the electrical system. So the King Air 350 has what's called a triple feed bus system. And when you sketch it out on a diagram to kind of see where all the components interact, you get this triangle shape. So the system ends up being very redundant, but there are pitfalls in that some indications are counterintuitive as to what it is that you're looking at when something does fail. So you have to spend a fair bit of time looking at those diagrams and talking yourself through, okay, if this current limiter fails, then what happens? And if this bus over voltages or has a short, what happens there? So that's what ground training is really focused on. And you do this for all the major components of the aircraft. So you'll look at fuel systems, you'll look at propulsion systems, you'll look at electrical, hydraulics, avionics, et cetera, et cetera. Depending on the complexity of the airplane, that can get to be a pretty rigorous process. So fortunately for the King Air, like I said, fairly simple airplane, relatively speaking, but you do need to know where things can fail, how things can fail, and how to deal with that as a pilot. The other thing you're going to spend a fair bit of time on during ground study is the limitations. So what can you do with the airplane? How does the airplane have to be configured? When can you do certain things? When can you not do certain things? How does that all interact? And how does it interact with the systems of the aircraft? There's a fair bit of time in ground training spent on figuring that stuff out. Now, fortunately for flight safety King Air courses, they spend a fair bit of time walking you through each different system. Each system has a set of limitations, each system has a set of normal procedures, and you spend time digging through each one of those in a fair level of detail. The advantage to this is you don't have to learn everything all at once, but rather you can figure out, okay, electrical system has the following limitations, A, B, C, D. The fuel system has the following limitations, A, B, C, D. And because of that, you have time to learn those things, particularly like I said, if you're studying outside of the course. So at the end of the ground school, you do have to take a written exam. And the written exam is focused on basic aircraft operating principles and limitations. Flight safety did a great job walking us through the basic aircraft requirements and high-level operations and limitations and failure modes associated with the King Air 350 prior to taking the written exam. We probably spent 3 hours on it. So before you start your written exam, you should be pretty well prepared. And really, it's very similar to any written exam that you've taken for your private, commercial, instrument, multi. However, it's just aircraft specific. So you're going to look at specific weight and balance, specific systems, etc. So simulator training, this is the fun part. When you start simulator training, the focus is on learning how to operate the system from just a basic manipulation point of view. You're just learning how to set power, how to manipulate the fuel system or the electrical system, how to run normal checklists. So while you've spent time during your ground training to get familiar with those things, you've never laid hands on anything. So the simulator is a full replica of the actual cockpit of the standard production airplane. So if you have an aircraft that has different STCs or modifications done to it, there may be some differences there, but the basic standard airplane is replicated in the flight simulator. As you go through flight simulator training, you're going to basically work your way up to the more complex tasks, just like your instructor has you do for any other type of new aircraft. You're not going to start with power off 180s. You're not going to start with simulated engine failures. You're going to start with slow flight, steep turns, stalls, normal landings, normal takeoffs, and work your way up from there. One of the big aspects to simulator training is learning avionics. So fortunately, I have a fair bit of experience with Garmin G1000, G3000, G5000 systems. So for me, taking a King Air course with the G1000 was a real benefit. It allowed me to focus on how to fly the airplane rather than how to fly the avionics. But if you're new to an avionics system in the airplane you're doing your training in, for example, Proline Fusion or Proline 21, or if you've never seen Garmin before, the avionics training that you get by sitting in the simulator and manipulating the actual controls is invaluable. It's hard to underestimate how important it is to be comfortable with the avionics prior to going into the actual aircraft itself. So what's simulator training like? First thing is, the simulators are located in a really large, tall building with a walkway that leads down to the simulator. They're fairly large pieces of equipment, bigger than you would imagine, substantially larger than the aircraft itself. They sit on hydraulic motion bases, and you go in there, and it's a cab. There's an operator station in the rear of the simulator for the instructor to sit at, along with a couple of observation chairs. And then there's the pilot co-pilot seat and a full replica of the cockpit. Initially, simulator training can be a little disorienting because your inner ear is a little confused by the change from no motion to lots of motion. The trick really is to look at the screens that are displaying the outside environment and really focus on the simulator like you would the airplane. So the simulator training, like I said, builds in complexity. Our first couple days of King Air training were focused on fairly low risk scenarios, normal operations, normal engine starts, normal landings, takeoffs, climbs, etc. And then we built into high performance scenarios, so taking off out of high density elevations in the mountains with simulated engine failures, and then progressing into real engine failures. We also looked at engine restarts and those kinds of events as we built through those first couple days of normal systems operation. From there, you build into the more extreme maneuvers. V1 cuts, engine failures on go-arounds, high crosswind values, those kinds of events. The critical thing for most multi-engine turbine aircraft, particularly turboprops like the King Air, are engine failures during takeoff. So there's a couple decision points that you have to make. You know, are you before or after V1? Prior to V1, you're going to abort to the runway. And sometimes that's a counterintuitive and or difficult decision to make as a pilot. We're very success-oriented people. When the engine quits, we really need to drill into our heads that if we're before our V1 speed, you're aborting. And recognizing that failure and making that decision in a timely manner becomes very critical, especially in large turboprops like the King Air, where you have large prop effects and large moment arms on the engines. So we probably spent 2.5, 3 hours repeatedly doing engine cuts at V1 or during go-arounds. And you're able to do a dozen of those in quick succession because you can just simply reset the sim. That's the advantage of doing this in the simulator versus in the real airplane. I would not want to do a real V1 cut in a King Air if I could at all help it. So the simulator becomes an invaluable resource for that. Now, your training provider, be it flight safety, CAE, whoever else it might be, is going to have a standard profile that you're going to fly for approaches, for takeoffs, for landings. That profile may or may not end up reflecting what it is that you do in the real world. That profile is geared towards making you successful for the check ride. It's not that the profile is bad, it's not that the profile is necessarily unsafe or a poor operating technique. Rather, it's a starting place, shall we say. It gives you an idea of what kind of performance to expect at a given power setting, at a given airspeed, at a given configuration. And all of those things are critical to making sure that you have a good check ride. So the more that you follow that profile, at least during simulator training, the more successful you're going to be in the check ride. And if you're successful during the check ride, you can transition those skills into the airplane itself. Personally, based on our profile at Flight Safety, I would probably fly the airplane a little bit differently. But for training, that consistent profile is predictable, and predictability is good. So just be prepared to know that your simulator instructor may have you fly the airplane a little bit differently than you fly other similar airplanes, or that you would expect to fly the airplane. But it's a normal thing. Finally, the check ride. This is the whole point of the whole thing. So the check ride consists of two different portions. There's the oral exam and the flying portion of the exam, which is just like every other check ride you've ever taken. Now, you're probably going to be in a course with a sim partner, be it another coworker who you're going to be flying the same airplane with, or just a random person that also happened to be at course that week. During the oral portion of the check ride, you'll be in there with the sim partner. I was actually in my sim training with my boss, so we got to sit and do our oral exam together, and it makes the whole situation pretty low-key and low stress, because you've been spending 2 weeks, 3 weeks, or more looking at the same sets of limitations and requirements and system design issues that you're going to have your oral over. So by this point, you've got a fair bit of familiarity with the airplane. And then the examiner is going to go back and forth between you and your partner, and it's really not a stressful thing. By this point, it's pretty relaxed, which is great. Now, if you're taking a type rating check ride for a single pilot airplane, so the CJ family of aircraft that I talked about earlier, or the King Air 350 in my case, you're going to take the flying portion of the check ride by yourself. It's going to just be you and the examiner in the simulator cab. It's not too big a deal because during the training you will have flown the profile once or twice previously. So the check ride should not be too stressful from that point of view. The big thing with the check ride itself is to remember to slow down. There's no time limit on it. There's no rush. There's no points for going fast. So slow down. Take your time. Fly the profile that you've been taught to fly over the last 2 weeks. Just relax. Enjoy it. There's always check ride jitters. That makes total sense. Just relax and slow down. I probably made some mistakes that I shouldn't have made just because I didn't slow down. Now, just like any check ride, you should be good and proficient before you start the check ride. So if you're not feeling comfortable, you need to address that with your sim training instructor prior to the check ride. The check ride will be done to ATP standards. It will be done in instrument conditions, and it will probably be done at night. So you're going to be flying in pretty awful conditions most of the time. It's not a big deal. Again, you have the profile that you've learned over the last week or 2 weeks of sim training. The trick is just to slow down, take your time, because you've been training to those standards anyway to that point. So in conclusion, type ratings are fun. They're a challenge. They push your boundaries as a pilot. They teach you where your limitations are. Personally, I know I learned a lot about my task saturation thresholds. The King Air 350 is by no means a complicated airplane, but it can be a challenging airplane to fly. So I learned a lot about where my personal limits are. The most important thing about sim training and type training in particular to remember is to have fun. The more fun I was having, if I was in the mental space of I'm here to have fun, I'm learning a lot, I'm getting challenged, I'm pushed, but as long as I'm trying to have fun, the more I was in that mental space, the more I seemed to learn, the more successful I was. So don't let type training be a scary, unattainable thing. Just treat it as something that is a challenge, it's something new, it's something enjoyable, it's going to give you new skills, new capabilities, it's going to teach you new things about how to operate complex, high-performance airplanes in challenging environments, and it overall is going to make you a much better pilot.